Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Leela, for running through the findings. I think it's really important research. As you said, one of the things we hear so regularly is, everyone is, I think, keenly aware of diversity and inclusion challenges across Asia. But there's often a measure of resistance to policies that are being formulated perhaps thousands of miles away and don't take into account local market realities. So I think this kind of research is really important. But let's start with, I suspect, the question that is likely to take up a reasonable amount of time, I think, which is, how do you balance those global priorities with the local market challenges, with the need to customize what you're doing to the specific factors in a specific local market, be that Japan or India or China or Australia? As we saw in the research, there are quite significant differences between the markets. So how do you adapt and tailor to these while also keeping whatever the global policy is in mind? And Mel, perhaps I could start with you, please.
Sure. So thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. And thanks for the opportunity to join the panel. I think very much at Johnson & Johnson, we have global, regional and market responsibilities. And our approach to that is that at its core, diversity and inclusion is about that core concept of the human being, right? And when we think about that, every market is at a different point in that evolution and has different needs, right? But at that global level, the position of your company should be pretty universal. And so for me, it's not the strategy, as we were saying, but it's the execution. Mm-hmm. And then I think our philosophy is very much empowerment to the markets around where they would like to take that. And then also balancing what is the best voice for us to do that. Is it at that corporate level of Johnson & Johnson? Very often we actually do it through our brands, because there's a nimbleness in your brands and your nimbleness that you're talking to that specific group, and when you're trying to convert that DEI and create broader awareness and acceptance.
Okay, so empower local markets in terms of execution only, but also strategy, would you say?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so I think the strategy is interesting, right? Because globally you tend to take a position, but it tends to be a relatively straightforward, but in some ways broad position, right? It tends not to be quite narrow. Yep. And so I think as long as you're operating within that, then, so if you take something like LGBTQI, that is very different in very different markets around the world. And so then if you come back again and you say, well, how do we create that inclusion in that market? How do we move that forward in the way that we're wanting to do it? The local market is best positioned to be able to do that. And so it's less at that point about strategy and more about local nuance and execution.
So a lot of listening, I guess, required to people on the ground. Devyani, how do you see it, given that you're overseeing diversity and inclusion and belonging for LinkedIn across a number of markets in Asia?
Yeah, so building on what I'm hearing from my fellow panelists, we also have sort of a tiered approach where we have global, regional, and market level priorities as well as execution. But I can try to bring it to life through some examples of the work we do. So I think at the highest level for our global priorities, we do ask what is totally critically important across the globe and what is it that we want to drive. And so the thing which comes up most there is culture. So we do have initiatives which are focused on culture, which are global. To bring that to life, for example, we are really focused on activating allyship amongst all of our employees. And so we do run several programs to do that. One of them is called Allyship Academy, where we invite anyone in any part of the world at any level to join this academy. They train how to be an ally, and then they can take the messages back to their teams. And we want to create this ripple effect. We actually run separate versions of that program in all regions. So the content is the same, but the examples we're using are customized to that region and then further to that country. And the end outcome is really trying to develop those inclusive behaviors which we want to be global, and we want everybody at LinkedIn to be talking about it and actually speaking that language. So that's one. The second piece is areas where we have global aspirational goals, but we do have regional implementation because we recognize the regional nuances. A good example of this is our gender work. Like a lot of you here, we're also focused on increasing the representation of women in leadership and women in technology. Women in technology is a big one for all tech firms. This is a global aspiration for us. We continue to work towards it, but the implementation is very, very local. So for example, we run cohort development programs, and we run one for women in technology, specifically women engineers. So our program in the US versus our program in India is a similar format, but run completely differently, content tailored to the markets. So again, regional implementation of a global aspiration. And then finally, hyper-local, which is really looking at bottoms up what's important in that country. So good examples of that is our work for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, where we're really focused on activating allyship towards the Indigenous people, as well as really now moving towards, can we also look at doing more hiring through internship programs? And more recently, even our work with people with disabilities in Singapore, we recognize the government is investing in it, and this is a good time for us to actually continue to double down and look inwards on how we can contribute. So those are some examples.
Mm. A lot of listening, a lot of letting go, it sounds like, in terms of the work. Leela, do you think that's happening often enough when we look at big global MNCs?
I think that there's a huge opportunity to make sure that we're actually inviting all of the different perspectives from different countries. I mean, I think, I'll give an example of a client that we worked with last year. So they were looking to provide toolkits for their global communicators network. And sometimes you can localize things, but sometimes you have to make choices. For example, you can only have maybe one website. You have to put language on that website that you feel like will resonate in a number of your markets. But then, of course, you will have some market-specific communications as well. And one of the things that was interesting was we started on the journey of inviting feedback from different stakeholders across the markets and really making sure that our team was representative of the different markets that they were existing in. And for example, the toolkit that was really focused on race and ethnicity, for example. Well, that terminology resonated in some of the markets, but not all, but adding culture to that, so it was race, ethnicity, and culture, made sure that it resonated with more of the markets. That was something that maybe seems small, but made a world of difference. And I also think that one of the things that we've learned in the journey is it's not necessarily as simple just to say, okay, well, I'm going to have a team member from this market. Even within each of the markets, as all of you representing so many different places in this room know, there's many different perspectives even within the countries in APAC as well. And so I think there's just a huge opportunity as we move forward to make sure that we're both for local communications, of course, tailoring things to make sure that we're using inclusive language and things that will resonate in market, but also for global communications, inviting reviews of those communications that are representative of the places where we work.
Okay. So it really does require, I think we talk about public relations, it really does require that kind of first principle of listening to the key stakeholders. The research shows that most people in Asia Pacific know about DE&I, I think 71%, but only 1 in 5 are very familiar. So I'm keen to hear views on whether that is a challenge and how, in fact, you are familiarizing your stakeholders, whether that's customers, employees, investors, communities, with your DE&I commitments, and why perhaps it's relevant and important to them. Devyani, if I could start with you, please.
Yeah, I think Linda set the stage for me. She talked about her experience with LinkedIn and how important some of this was. So I want to say the message is definitely resonating there. But I think for us, it's really important to not look at DE&I, or what we call diversity, inclusion, and belonging, as an addition to what anyone is doing. For us, diversity, inclusion, and belonging is a value we embody. It's really part of our core values. And another core value we have is we trust and care for each other. And I think those go hand in hand. So how we really bring it to life is that it has to be part of every communication, and it's the way we communicate rather than just talking about a program. So to give you an example, we do have a global initiative focused on building inclusive leaders. So we believe that all our people managers who manage people need to be inclusive leaders, but we also look at it as a skill set. And feel like we have set an expectation of what an inclusive leader at LinkedIn means, and then we do a lot of education around driving, how do you get there? And part of that is really how you communicate with your teams on a day-to-day basis. So it's really the mindset you adopt and how you act versus talking about a program. And the other thing for us is also we do a lot of listening and bottoms-up communication. Also, a large part of our work is our communities, or as we call them, employee resource groups. We have close to 600 plus employees globally who hold leadership positions in those communities, and they really are our eyes and ears on the ground. All the messaging we're hearing on how people are feeling, how messages are landing are actually coming from those folks, so we really leverage that community. And they're really like the DNA of our organization because they run several programs engaging our employees. Even in the pandemic, those communities really created opportunities for people to connect, even in virtual environments. We have something which we call In-Day, which is a day to invest in yourself every month. And a lot of our communities actually host several events to bring people together to really talk about the importance of being authentic and belonging at work. We have a specific In-Day focused on belonging, which again is the In-Day run by our communities. We have showcase months for all of our communities. So really, it's really part of everything, and we want it to be embedded in the way we operate rather than an addition. And lastly, I want to close with, we have an employee voice survey, which we run every quarter. And we use that as a sort of a dipstick to check how people are feeling when it comes to belonging or when it comes to our commitment to DE&I. So that's really a constant upward feedback to ensure that the messages are going through.
Mm. That's a lot. It's a lot of work. It's quite impressive to hear that all. Leela, building on that, do you see specific challenges when companies are trying to familiarize all of their stakeholders because they're having to look internal and increasingly external as well?
Yeah, I see it less of a challenge and more of an opportunity. I mean, I think Mel said it really well. This is about the human aspect of communications, and I think done right, these can be some of the most powerful communications that your organization puts out, right? This is really about telling the stories of your employees. I think LinkedIn's a great platform for that as well, but I know that we've seen that just even from a recruitment perspective as well, having the people who are making up our great organization tell their own stories, their own backgrounds, brings a real, I think, dynamism to communications. So I think it's more of an opportunity than a challenge. At least I like to see it that way. I think it makes the work more fun.
Sure. So another thing we saw in the research is a high demand for corporations to communicate openly with their employees, and that companies are being judged based on how fair and equitable they are in terms of their workforce. But of course, what we've also seen over the past 2 years is big changes in how people work and how workforces are distributed across the region. So I'm keen to hear if you've had to take any particular steps in terms of addressing inclusion across the kind of office, hybrid, remote work from home environment, and whether that has played a factor in maybe changing some of your strategies and tactics. And Mel, if I could start with you, please.
Yes, let me just start with that, and I think it sort of builds on where we were before. So ultimately, to really live into those principles, whether it's work from home, hybrid, in the office, employee, it's customers, whatever, but we'll focus on employees for this. It has to be part of the DNA of your organisation. And without it being part of the DNA of the organisation, it's not going to work. It becomes a token thing that someone else does something that sends an email on the wall. And so when we look at that within Johnson & Johnson, it has been part of our organisation for 140 years. So when Johnson & Johnson was founded with 16 employees, half of them were female, and from day one, women were able to be taking care of their families, and it is built into what we have called our credo. So if anyone is familiar with Johnson & Johnson, we have a credo, and it's a set of principles by which we operate and live by for all those who we have a responsibility to, of which one is our employees. And when you haven't worked in Johnson & Johnson, it's very hard to believe that we actually live by this, but we genuinely live by this. And that for those who perhaps aren't aligned necessarily with our creator behaviours, as we call it, they tend to self-select themselves out of the organisation because it's not an organisation that perhaps they're necessarily aligned within their values and that. So how does that relate to DE&I? It relates to it because we've had that from the very beginning. And I think when you have it from the beginning, you're adding a building block and a building block. All of our conversations relate around inclusivity, right? So there's obviously the things like you have at LinkedIn. So I have on my performance evaluation, I have to say what I've done for DE&I. We have, we have to have inclusive slates when we recruit for roles. So there I think that are all the easy things. But how do we engage it from the ground up with employees, which to your point, I think is how do we get there with that? One of our really big focuses is around employee resource groups. And that is where, again, this work from home hybrid comes into play, because it's the individuals who are opting into that, not only because they have particularly passionate about it, personally from their own situation, but also because they want to support those who are within that. And as an organisation, we globally and regionally it's looked at, so the Women's Leadership Initiative is something that's been around for 30 years in the organisation. It would be very strange for a country to not have a WLI group, right? And we focus very much on, it's not just women in WLI, it's not a mother's group where you learn how to knit, it's about empowerment of women, and part of that inclusivity is having men involved. In our Open and Out group, which is LGBTI, it's not just for people who identify as that, and that is their sexual orientation, it is for everybody, because it dilutes that message. And to your point, it creates that ground up swell, it creates interconnectivity, and it becomes that lifeblood of the organisation. So it's how we communicate, whether it's on Zoom, whether it's in the office, it's how we operate, it's in our language. And then when we go externally, it's then lived outside of that organisation. It's how you show up to that customer or that doctor or whoever, your community partner. So that's our approach.
Devyani, how have you addressed that particular issue in terms of ensuring inclusion isn't forgotten when people are working remotely?
Yeah. So I have to say that for us, it wasn't hard to move to virtual initially, because we did have a concept like a lot of tech companies to have video calls always, even prior. So I think that transition was slightly easy. But one of the things which I talked about earlier is our value to trust and care for each other. And I think that was the principle which kind of got activated in the pandemic, where that had to come out through everything we were doing, that we really care for each other. So we did do a lot of different things to activate that trust and that sense of inclusion and belonging. One good example is a program which we launched during the pandemic called Lift Up. And it really was to lift up people when they're feeling down and out in the moment. And as part of this program, we had several opportunities for folks to connect with each other in that virtual environment. We even had things like virtual music festivals. We had things like, communities coming together, like our families community, was really at the helm of things when the COVID situation got really bad in India. They actually kept the morals very high. They had a lot of practitioners come and talk. But I think what I wanted to talk about Lift Up is that even when we did those things like a music festival, we made sure that we're showcasing talent from across the world. We're really bringing in that diversity which exists within our organization, and people from across the world have that sense of belonging. I can be who I want. I can showcase whatever I want. So that really is like the principal operating priority. We care for you, and it comes up in everything we do. You have the right to be yourselves at work. And the other thing I want to add is, on a more programmatic level, we created a lot of asynchronous resources for teams to use and to really have conversations about real topics. That was one thing my team actually activated during the pandemic. So talk about things like microaggressions, how they show up virtually, talk about intention and impact. And these are really team resources which team could take on their own, self-serve, and actually have conversations about them. And I think those have really activated some real issues that are coming up in the virtual environment. People have the space to speak about them and address them.
Mm-hmm. And Leela, presumably this is something you've seen both in terms of clients, but also in terms of the agency, right? Because you've had people out of the office. And meanwhile, at the same time, you've had a number of social issues as well that have emerged over the last couple of years. How have you seen that play out from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think one of the programs that I'd love to highlight is Lose the Whisper. So I think it's really important for us to remember, working for global organizations, how attractive it is to talent to be part of a global organization and to feel that. It's one thing to sort of know you're part of a global company, but to be able to actually see it and experience it is a different thing. So that's a platform that we've introduced in the past few years, which really brings together our talent from around the world to unpack some of these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to hear firsthand from their colleagues. And I think it's been really amazing. I think it's opened people's eyes to some of the issues that they may not have been as familiar with, and to hear it from a very deeply human perspective. So I think that's one of the benefits of a remote environment, is that you actually can connect to your workforce in ways that maybe weren't as possible before. So I think that's been really incredible, but I don't think it's enough to sort of stop there. So what we learned from these Lose the Whisper sessions was that people were really enjoying it, but they were sort of wanting more after it. It wasn't enough to just sort of be like absorbing the content, or maybe hearing a panel speak about their experiences, living with neurodiversity or some aspect of DE&I. And so what we've also been able to couple that with at some of the local office level is more intimate settings where people can then come together in smaller settings and unpack what they've heard and talk about that in a way that maybe feels more action-oriented and more engaging for them. So I think that's just one example of how these worlds can come together and take the benefits of both being very global and integrated, as well as being local.
So some of the markets surveyed, we saw people were less open to talking about DE&I issues. I think Japan and Korea in particular. So I'm kind of curious to hear how you address that, where there are lower comfort levels in terms of talking about certain topics. So, Devyani.
So I think, like I talked about, when we have resources which are for everybody, we look at what customization means in each market. And so some of the resources I talked about, which are more asynchronous, like the conversations, it's almost like, as we set the stage, and then there's an opportunity to discuss scenarios or what takes place in your market. So I think those are something that are beginning to work well, because we really go into like, what are microaggressions like in the Japan market versus actually in the China market? And then folks in the room are actually talking about those things. So there's an opportunity for us to customize the resource. So that has been one way. The other thing we're trying to do more and more of is do things in the local language. Because some of these conversations are very personal, and for people to be able to be comfortable to talk about it, sometimes it's hard to not talk about in a language which is your first language. So we're trying to do more of that, wherever there's an opportunity to create spaces for people to connect in their local language. So recently we hosted a disability awareness workshop for Japanese colleagues, fully in Japanese, led by a Japanese partner. So I think we're trying to do more and more of those kind of things. And then we're also sort of looking at how we can leverage LinkedIn to have those conversations. So we've recently launched LinkedIn in Hindi in India, and again, creating that space to have that conversation and drive that discourse.
The local language, very important. Mel, is this an issue for you at all? Do you see this as a challenge in specific markets, or is it not something that you face?
So yes and no. Let me answer it like that. So when I was listening to you, because I agree with what you're saying, people usually don't have awareness or don't want to admit to an awareness because either they're generally just not aware, or they're scared to admit they're aware, right? And so how do you address that? Right? So as I said before, we have a pretty formalised program around employee resource groups that are pretty much 100% dedicated to inclusivity and creating inclusivity. Yeah. You talk about it, I think, is number one. Talking about it is really important, but I think living into it is also important. And sometimes that is very challenging, and you have to be brave as an organisation. And if I come back again, so some of the ones, WLI is pretty easy now. Most people are aware of gender equality in the workplace. It's not always there, but it's very. When you come to some more of those social issues that perhaps may be illegal but we have people who want to be represented in our organisation, and we consider ourselves neutral in our organisation. So regardless of the external law, we don't make big, but we find that having formal structures, it's momentum based. So if it's in Singapore, then maybe Japan will want to do it because there's a group of people who want to see it, and all of our employee resource groups are started ground up. We don't tell anyone, you have to start an employee resource group. They're ground up. And I think when people buy into that, it's very infectious. It may be a slow burn, but it's very infectious. And I think that tends to be the way that I mean, it's part of our DNA, so it's very hard for me to describe because I'm coming in well under the curve of where we're at. But we don't have those challenges per se, except maybe some of those more sensitive social issues when groups are looking to bring them into market.
Leela, how do you balance those kind of competing demands perhaps when it comes to clients, maybe even your agency as well? You have perhaps people in certain markets who are looking for greater inclusion, but you maybe have lower comfort levels than others, and maybe there's laws as well that you have to navigate.
Yes. I mean, I think that's part of why we're so excited about this research and why we've looked at 10 markets. And another thing that we do internally within our organization, that survey was external, but every year we survey all of our employees on a very extensive survey related to their views on diversity, equity, and inclusion within our own organization. And I think just being able to be informed by, to your point, listening, what are we hearing from people? And I think that helps us find those entry points too. And part of what we will be sharing, I guess, in the coming months is the very, very deep dive, market by market analysis of where might those entry points be for some of the markets where perhaps there's a little bit less of a comfort. But I think one of the things that was really, I think, exciting for me as someone who, works in this field and has for a long time is really having that validation from the survey, having, asked 5,000 people, is even in the markets where perhaps there's, relatively less comfort, that there is interest on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think that there's some level of engagement and I think an opportunity to really deepen the conversation. So I feel heartened by that.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we go to the floor. When we talk about DE&I, I don't think we can ignore the potential for backlash and opposition, whether internal or external. You can see occasionally people, well, not occasionally, but you often see a lot of opposition to it as this kind of woke nonsense. We've also seen employee backlash in, for example, big tech companies on the west coast of the USA. So how do you deal with that? Mel?
So number one, breathe, right? So I think that's really important, right? The world isn't ending. We've got a social media storm happening that is probably like every other crisis going to go away or tail off in 48 hours. So that's my first thing. When we're a very big organisation, we at any time of the day, one of our markets is having a backlash on us about something. Number two, breathe. Number two, it's a part of life, right? The question then to say is, as you get experience, for all that noise, how influential is it? Really? As long as, and I say that as long as you are very clear in what your position on the day actually is, right? You can go to Twitter. I don't know, I'm addicted to Twitter. You go to Twitter and you can get someone who agrees with you or makes you cross at any moment. And so if they're not the people that we're targeting as part of our brand or our reputation, you do you, I say to them. That's okay. We don't need to engage in that conversation. But the baseline is our policy clear? Is our position clear? And I think that's the baseline. All right. We will then, when things happen, do all the usual things you would do in a crisis communication, which is communicate to our employees, do all of that. But it's really breathe, assess, decide whether you want to engage.
Devyani?
I think we create spaces to listen. We want to create that dialogue, and we know people have different points of view. So we are consciously creating active spaces, even when that's not happening, for people to have those conversations and share their point of view. And also for others to be able to learn. And that's why we talk about cultural humility at work. We talk about, different identities and the privileges we hold. Because it's really in moments like that when those show up and we can truly exhibit those behaviors of allyship or being an inclusive leader, because you're really on this journey of being curious and learning. And the other thing, at least from our LinkedIn platform, we do have an opportunity there as well, I feel. And so we do have things like our insights reports, which really are factual and are looking at the trends and the data to inform some of these conversations. So we also try to keep that factual and real.
Leela, I would imagine this is a challenge you see across clients.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, it comes down to just coming back to the business imperative of how important diversity, equity, and inclusion is. I really believe in my heart of hearts that companies and organizations that are not taking this seriously are going to be rendered irrelevant in the future. I don't think that you're going to be able to reach as many customers. I don't think you'll be able to create the best possible work environment for talent. And so it really comes down to not a nice to do, but something that should be critical as a business driver. And I think probably even the greater risk is DE&I fatigue. I think, because there's been more attention to these issues in the past couple of years, and this work is long and it is sometimes hard. I think that there's it's hard to keep the momentum going. And so I think, part of what I hope, I think for those of us that are working in this space and for others to join is just to keep the momentum going, because this is a movement, not a moment.
Okay, any questions from the floor, please? No, don't be shy. No, okay. Well, I'll ask another question then. One of the things that came out in the research is that social media is the most important channel for learning about DE&I. And obviously, Devon, you work for LinkedIn, so this is something I think that would be really, very relevant for you. But how much of a challenge does that pose when you're trying to communicate accurate and factual messages, given the potential for half-truths and misinformation on social media?
I think there's both sides to it, right? We can always use social media positively as well. So I think that's what we're trying to drive. And like I talked about, our ability to look at insights on our platform and what talent trends are coming up. We also launched a gender insights report that informs, some decisions, actually helps our clients look at like where they're looking for talent, how they're hiring that talent, what are the skills in the market. We also have LinkedIn Learning. We have recently looked at curating a lot of DE&I content on LinkedIn Learning, which is from trusted sources, good speakers. Again, an opportunity to create that ability for folks to learn about it and have a conversation around it. So yeah, I think from our end, we're trying to leverage our platform in a positive way to really drive those messages. We do have a team which is now called Equity, which sits in our product team, and their focus is just to ensure like how we can create more equitable experiences on the LinkedIn platform.
Do you see this as a particular challenge for you, Mel? I know you said you were addicted to Twitter, but I don't know if this is something that...
Yeah, so being consumer brands, obviously so I work in the consumer health sector of J&J. All of our brands are very focused on social. And so yes, it's really important to us, and it's really important for us to, our positioning, number one, needs to be aligned with our company positioning. So you don't want to, on a positive level, go out and appear to be tokenism. So if there's a social issue that's happening that you haven't laid stake to or claim to or already declared your position, that is probably not the right time to go out and make a conversation around that, because you will get negative backlash for jumping on the bandwagon, so to speak. Having said that, we do take it as a social responsibility and the right thing to do to talk about that. And we try to do it in ways that are easy to be digested and accepted. So for example, and in unique execution so that they stand out. So when I think about an execution we recently did for Mother's Day in Thailand, it was linked to a social kind of experiment that we did. And it was all about those mothers who feel that they are not worthy. And the reason that they were identified as not worthy, even though they were 100% worthy as mothers, we don't judge, is because it may have been a transgender mother. That was one. It may have been a mother who earned her income from ways that is not necessarily acceptable society, was covered in tattoos and has a criminal background. There was a group of women that were used. And that was about inclusivity. That was about inclusivity of women. And so that's how we tend to focus on that. Do we get negative comments about those? Yeah, we do. That's okay. It's what I said before. That's our position. We're okay with that. We're okay for people to be negative, right? And, as I'm sure you'd agree, if you're not going to be polite on our platform and just go on a rant, then we're very, very specific in removing those types of comments. Negative ones, no. Those are the ones we will. Negative is just exactly what I said before. But yeah.
Okay. And so finally, to close, if I could ask each of you, what would your one action point be for everyone in this room if they will, to make progress in terms of DE&I, not just in terms of global policies, but at a local level? Mel, maybe I could start with you again, please.
Okay. So I come back to the why. At its heart, DEI is all about belonging. And so if we want our employees to thrive and belong in our company, then we can't do it without being a diverse and inclusive workforce. If we want our products to be used by consumers or whoever else, unless they are identifying with the corporation and the brand that is offering those products, then you will not be successful. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about belonging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Devyani?
I would say that we're at a very interesting time when it comes to DE&I or D&I, whatever you call it, in the region. This is really the first time, I'm sure Leela would agree, that there's a discourse developing around what does it mean in this part of the world, and it's becoming less and less Western, and really what does it mean to us. So I think at this point, what all of us can do is just be really curious. And always try to find out what we don't know. We have so much richness in our region in terms of culture, in terms of communities. I'm sure there's something everybody doesn't know. So figure out what that is and make that investment to learn more.
Okay. And Leela?
I think we've talked a lot about what happens at sort of an organizational level, but I think probably what I would leave everyone in this room with is that this is each of our individual responsibility to be part of the solution. We each probably are involved in hiring candidates. So we can think about, do we have a diverse pool of candidates? Are we being unbiased or being thoughtful in the way that we explore different candidates, maybe candidates that come from other backgrounds than perhaps you would have looked at previously. Similarly, we're all in meetings. And sometimes we can help create space for people in the room who may be younger in their careers, maybe from a different background. And it can be something as simple as inviting them into the conversation. So I guess I would just think that those micro moments and micro decisions that we make can actually lead up to a huge amount of impact. Each piece of content that we develop as communicators, we can develop with an inclusive language lens. Each piece of creative that we develop, we can put a lens on it to make it more inclusive. So I just think that each one of us, whether diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually in our title or our job description, we are all responsible for the solution. So I hope that that is something that everyone can take from this conversation today.
Indeed, yeah. Excellent advice. Thank you all so much. Can you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Mel, Devyani, and Leela. Thank you.